Today, that is April 19th, South Korea marks precisely 63 years since its first mass public struggle for democracy, as described by historians here. So what happened on this particular day in 1960? How has Korea's past shaped its present democratic values? And what more can be done to better promote democracy here and elsewhere? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we address the state of democracy here in Korea and elsewhere as we mark a meaningful event in local history. For more, I have Professor Koen De Ceuster at Leiden University over in the Netherlands live on the line. Professor De Ceuster, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Good morning, and I'm glad to be here. Yes,
right, a pleasure. All the pleasure's ours. I also have Kwon Soa here in the studio with us. Soa, it's good to have you here.
Happy to be here, Sunny.
Right, so we'll start here in the studio then. Let's begin with some details about the April Revolution here in Korea.
Right, the April Revolution, or the April 19th Revolution, refers to a pro-democracy movement against South Korea's government some 6 decades ago. And it involves a nationwide mass protest against then-President Lee Seung-man over rising discontent over his autocratic rule, corruption, and political repression. That had grown in particular following a rigged election in March that worked in favor for Lee. Lee Seung-man was the first president of South Korea after its liberation from Japan's colonial rule and served 12 years as president before his administration's downfall in 1960. He was also the president of the provisional government we spoke about just a week ago. Now, what sparked the April Revolution was a student-led demonstration that started on April 11th, 1960 in Masan, a port city in Gyeongsang-namdo province. It was triggered by the death of a high school student in Masan named Kim Joo-yeol, who was arrested by police after participating in a pro-democracy demonstration. And with his body later discovered in waters off Masan, it was found that he had been killed by a tear gas grenade. Now, thousands of students took to the streets for days, demanding the resignation of former President Lee Seung-man. And the movement spread to other parts of the country, including the capital, Seoul. Spearheaded by students at Korea University, a protest was launched on April 18th at the National Assembly calling for new elections. And both the Masan and Seoul protests were met with violent crackdowns by the police and military. Then came April 19th, which is also referred to as Bloody Tuesday, a large-scale protest involving mostly students, again estimated at around 100,000 in total in Seoul, but also across the country. That was a key event that eventually overthrew the Lee government. And protests continued for several days, with citizens and professors also joining the students. April 26th was the day when Lee stepped down and went into exile. The April Revolution led to the death of 186 people and around 100 of them in the capital, Seoul. April 19th until today is recognized as a turning point of South Korea's democracy.
Right. And that being said, Professor De Ceuster, what is your assessment of Korea's democracy? Is it a maturing democracy as described by some scholars? And how is Korea's past shaping its present democratic values, do you think?
Well, I think rather than to call it a maturing democracy, I would call it a mature democracy. I think the phase of South Korea's democracy developing its roots and being deeply ingrained in society is way past. And I think what we see in Korea's political system and the way democracy functions, the challenges it faces, are not dissimilar from what you see in other mature democracies. We'll come to talk about it, but democracy and democratic institutions are weakening, it seems. In that sense, I would say South Korea is in tune with the rest of developed, mature democracies in what we call the West. In terms of how the past shapes the democratic values in Korea, inevitably you cannot escape history. And South Korea's history is definitely determining the way, the process and the progress of South Korea's democracy and how society thinks and constructs its democratic institutions. It's interesting that we go back today, of course, obviously to April 19th, and it is in a way a very important reminder of the democratic aspirations of the Korean people. But at the same time, we should not forget that April 19th was followed by June 16th and the coup d'etat by Park Chung-hee, who in a way hijacked the legacy of April 19th, claimed the legacy of April 19th, but installed an authoritarian regime just the same. And so the progress of democracy and the democratic struggle is something that goes in phases, and went from the April 19th revolt to the June through the Kwon Uprising in 1980 to the June Uprising in 1987. So it's a gradual process where society struggled to break down the walls of authoritarian rule, I would say. And that process, I think, has been completed. But democracy is never fully complete. It's a dynamic process that constantly responds to ongoing developments.
Right, indeed. And staying with what Professor De Ceuster just said, so do tell us a bit about the other democratic movements that followed the April 19 revolution, that is.
Sure, Sunny. Following the 1960 April Revolution, things were very unstable for a while. I mean, getting rid of one authoritarian president does not solve all the problems. Just as Professor De Ceuster mentioned, it happened in phases. So authoritarianism did not stop in the following years here. A pivotal moment, though, in South Korea's transition to democracy came with the 1987 June Democratic Movement, or June Democracy Movement, also referred to as the June Struggle. It was a nationwide pro-democracy movement that inherited the values of the April Revolution and was held from June 10th to the 29th. Millions of people participated. Now, this time, not only majorly students, but activists, labor unions, ordinary citizens, the middle class, intellectuals, and etc. And this forced the ruling government to adopt democratic reforms and bring an end to authoritarian rule. In the same year, within the background of political reforms, the Great Workers' Struggle, involving over 1 million workers, took place, calling for better working conditions. And similarly, 1996 to 1997, the workers' general strike that is, was held, led to more calls for labor reforms. And when speaking about protests in Korea, we cannot leave out the peaceful candlelight protests that have been praised globally as a symbol of democracy. Now, major events being the 2004 candlelight protest against the National Assembly's impeachment of late President Roh Moo-hyun, and the most recent event that many of us can remember, of course, being the candlelight revolution that pretty much resulted in the ousting of former President Park Geun-hye.
Right, and staying with these public protests, Professor De Ceuster, pundits have pointed to a recurring pattern in Korean politics. That is the reality that powerful public protests, instead of the parliament that is, are the first movers of major political changes here in the country. What are your thoughts on this observation?
Oh, there are several observations to make. I think it is, it's always dangerous to paint South Korea as unique. I would say that we see worldwide demonstrations, street demonstrations that push political institutions towards change. Think, for example, what is happening today in Israel, where we see the ongoing demonstrations against the constitutional reform being pushed by Premier Netanyahu against the will of the people. It's in a way very similar to what we saw when Park Geun-hye was ousted. Ongoing, week by week, people who come to the streets for, in a way, very lofty ideals. They're not asking for anything material. They're asking for the protection of the Constitution and the constitutional separation of powers. And in a way, you could coming back to South Korea, what is remarkable in South Korea throughout its history, that there is on the one hand a very strong tradition of hierarchical power and respect for power, but at the same time there has always been undercurrent for egalitarianism. And I would go back as far as the Tonghak Rebellion in 1894, where peasants rose demanding a more egalitarian rule, respect for the equality of people, a very new political idea, but an undercurrent that has been there in Korean culture, I would say, for very, very long time. The idea that power should be questioned, confronted, approached with suspicion in a way. And I think that is certainly what drives, what continues to drive the very vocal protests we sometimes see in Korea. But at the same time, I would say it also has to do with how political institutions function and how they are rooted in society and represent society. If I may say so, and I realize that as a non-Korean, I should not express myself too loudly about developments in Korea. I think it's not my role. I'm an observer, an outside observer, but still, it has always struck me how disconnected parliament is from the real demands of society. I always found that Korea has a representational how should I say, an institutional democracy, where we go through the motions of having elections, and it looks all very democratic, but in the end, the way Parliament represents the needs and the demands of society is not always heard. And I think that certainly foments street protests, and it also explains the strong tradition of civil society movements. I think that is one of the remarkable developments of Korea's democratization. That is, after the success of the '87 uprising and the democratic developments that followed, the deepening of institutional democracy was the rise of civil society movements and the continued and organized pressure by society on political institutions, partly because these political institutions are more bickering amongst themselves than they are properly representing the demands of society, I would say.
Right, unfortunately, of course. And that being said, Professor De Ceuster, how does the state of Korea's democracy compare to that of its counterparts, perhaps in Europe, including the Netherlands?
It's difficult to compare democratic systems across the globe.
Of course.
But I think partly, as I said, I think Korea has become a mature democracy, and we see a similar problems in the Netherlands, in Europe, where there is a growing public distrust in political institutions, the idea that the institutions do not represent the will of the people. You can see this in the decreasing numbers of people taking part in elections, for example, but also in opinion polls where you see a growing decrease in trust in politicians and political institutions. I think on top of, well, one of the typical elements of this decrease is certainly, I would say, the rise of social media and the fracturing of public opinion. The fact that news and information is not channeled through one common channel anymore, but that parochial interests cater to specific interest groups. And so a scattering of what is considered to be truth, And the fact that these groups that live and are fed by social media and their specific social media channels seem to be unable to communicate anymore. And so, yeah, rival groups fail to, I mean, democracy is basically about opposites talking to each other and trying to find a compromise to move society forward. I think two things stand out. One is that maybe democracy, the way I understand it, is you have a state and you have political institutions representing society. And what certainly in the Netherlands we have seen over the last couple of years is a state that is distrustful of its people rather than to properly representing the interests of the people. On the one hand, and a distrust from society in return of political institutions. Yeah.
We need to work better on this distrust then, right? In the meantime, though, Soa, in recent days, Korea's past prosecutions of its presidents as a democratic country have been making headlines amid Donald Trump becoming the first former U.S. president to face criminal charges. That being said, could you very briefly walk us through Korea's own criminal charges against its former leaders?
Sure. What's quite historic in the U.S. actually is nothing new in some other democracies, including France, Israel, and South Korea. So with Trump's case, actually, South Korea's past has been brought up a lot in media, not only in Korea, but abroad. So let's talk about former President Park Geun-hye first, as I mentioned earlier, who had been ousted over a huge abuse of power scandal. She was initially sentenced to more than 20 years in prison, mostly for bribery and coercion, but has been pardoned in 2021. Another former South Korean President Lee Myung-bak, who has been just recently pardoned by the Yoon administration in 2022, was also sentenced to 17 years in prison for a range of corruption, bribery, and embezzlement crimes. And further in the past, former leaders Chun Do-han and No Tae-woo were behind bars for mutiny, treason, corruption. Although later pardoned, Chun even was sentenced to death for his role in suppressing of the Gwangju democracy movement. And yes, it's actually quite common that we also see not only the leaders once their term ends, but then also that families are involved in illegal acts.
Right. Professor De Ceuster, some say this prosecution of a former head of state is a fairly normal occurrence in the course of a functioning democracy. What are your thoughts regarding this particular assertion?
I think it is indeed. If democracy is about the separation of power and that the judiciary is the ultimate guarantor of the legality of rule, of democratic rule, then I think it stands to reason that former power holders are held to account ultimately, if not by the political institutions, then by the judiciary. And if I may push this line a little further, what is interesting is to see that in the waning of support for democracy that we see and the growing distrust that is fomented against democratic institutions is the fact that the judiciary and the independence of the judiciary is being questioned in many societies. Start to think about the way Donald Trump is undermining the judiciary in the US by claiming that it's all political vendettas. And you see it elsewhere also, a growing distrust of the independence of the judiciary. And I think it is important for democracies to maintain this independence because it is a key cornerstone of the balance of power within democratic systems. Ultimately, what you want is to prevent that there is an abuse of power by those who are temporarily representing the political will of the people.
Right. So briefly again, a few other countries, like you mentioned earlier, they've also prosecuted their former leaders as well, right? Could you briefly tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, as I said before, prosecuting former or even incumbent leaders is nothing new in quite a number of countries. In fact, according to research by Axios, since year 2000, heads of state in more than 75 countries have been prosecuted or jailed. And further in the past, since 1980, at least one such case was found in roughly half of the world's countries. And I've got a list here with some of the big names. However, I will just go through a number of countries: Argentina, Brazil, Croatia, France, Germany, Israel, Italy, Malaysia, South Africa, Pakistan, and the list goes on. All of these countries have had at least one case where their leaders or former leaders have been prosecuted. And some of the crimes include bribery in many cases, and also prostitution, money laundering, corruption, and the list goes on.
Right, unfortunately. Professor De Ceuster, many scholars around the world claim that democracy has been declining in recent years. Do you agree?
It's difficult not to see this development happening. Yes, you see a rise in authoritarianism, in authoritarian leaders. And I think the most shocking thing is certainly the fact that in a full-blown democracy, I mean the model democracy that we know and that I think it's commonly agreed when we look at the US, it is treated as the example of a democratic society, that there you have a leader like Donald Trump with clearly authoritarian aspects to him. Certainly somebody who is not very respectful of democratic institutions, doesn't have a democratic mindset, and is pushing the boundaries of the political institutions towards authoritarian rule. And we see, and I think that example has given rise to, how should I say, more a growing assertiveness of authoritarian tendencies. And there's plenty of examples for the moment around the world. The way some politicians are hollowing out democratic institutions. Think of the way Boris Johnson in Britain showed contempt for democratic institutions. He's currently still under investigation for lying to Parliament. Think of President Erdogan in Turkey, Premier Netanyahu in Israel. There's plenty of examples. Of course, President Putin in Russia is a clear example. At the same time, there are other developments also. I mean, there is a pushback on the part of societies to reclaim democracy. So, but let's say that yes, democracy is under threat, clearly. And I think it's important for democracies and democratic institutions to do a bit of self-reflection, and for politicians to ask themselves, who do I represent? Do I represent my own parochial interests and the interests of my specific constituency, or do I represent the interests of society? And I think there has to be, we have to come back to a kind of reflection on what democracy is really about.
Right, probably these events across the world and will provide people with a better chance to really assess democracy, as you mentioned, Professor De Ceuster. Well, that is all the time we have for this session. So, Professor De Ceuster, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Soa here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow, that is Thursday, for our talk with a very special guest on Korea's social welfare and more.